So, sorry for the shameless self-promotion, but just to give you some context of what I'm going to talk about today, what I'm going to talk about is coming pretty much straight out of the book I have forthcoming out in September. And so I thought I'd just show you some of the key points of that book where it's mainly focused on Julian and his writings and how he articulated his imperial identity through the lens of his particular brand of Iamblichean theurgic Neoplatonism and Hellenic radical paganism. And I come to various conclusions that go against the grain of a lot of modern assumptions about Julian, seeing him more as a realist than idealist, more down to earth than this sort of elevated divine, sort of post-Diocletian or Constantinian elevated being, more soldier than philosopher even. I take seriously when he says that he's not a philosopher but an amateur. And also, I look at how he emphasizes his Roman identity, often at the expense of his Greek identity, despite his reputation as being this sort of Greekling, right, who tries to play a Roman emperor. And something I won't really talk about in this context is this is in response to a lot of Christianizing readings of Julian that I've seen kind of resurge in the past few years that need to go away again. So another way to kind of think of my book project is isolating Julian's own voice through his own writings from the many other historical literary sources that we have to get an idea of like who he was as emperor, how he presented himself. And what I'm trying to see is that people like his fanboys, like Libanius, Hymerius, Mamertinus, are presenting an interpretation of him based on their own authorial agendas as rhetoricians, as historians, as polemicists, because of course, you know, his haters like Gregory Nazianzus, etc., will be doing the same, right? So today I'm going to focus on two Latin sources that have a lot to say about Julian, and rather than using them as historical sources for Julian, I'm going to look at them more as a-classicists, as pieces of rhetoric to give us an idea of how they interpret Julian in his relationship with philosophy in his imperial career. So I'm going to start with Claudius Mamertinus. And this is a Latin panegyric of a person who wrote a Latin panegyric of Julian that he presented on January 1st of the year 362 in the Senate House of Constantinople, just about a month after Julian came to power after the death of his former rival and cousin Constantius II. Now, Mamertinus was very close with Julian during his career in Gaul as Caesar before he was illegally elevated to Augustus and eventually went on the warpath with Constantius before Constantius thankfully died from his point of view. And we'll talk more about that later. But he was originally his treasury secretary, his comes superior officiorum, and then he was promoted by Julian to praetorian prefect. And then the occasion for this panegyric of Julian in Latin is that Julian appointed him as consul prior. So I talk with my hands. The first consul of the year 362, and so this is a gratiarum actio. It's a type of encomium where you're also giving thanks to the honorand as well as praising him, thanking him for appointing Julian appointing him consul. And in order to praise Julian, he is using his training in the Gallic schools of rhetoric, which in late antiquity, right, were kind of a powerhouse of education in places like Bordeaux. And they're using Cicero's various encomiastic speeches, as well as Pliny the Younger's Panegyricus to Trajan as models for their own oratory. And so eventually, Pliny's Panegyricus was paired with 11 other late antique panegyrics to various Tetrarchic and Constantinian emperors, as well as Theodosius I in what's called the Panegyrici Latini. And so this is part of that collection. And as in a lot of the other themes of these panegyrics, Claudius Mamertinus presents Julian as a model and embodiment of various Roman virtues, virtus pietas, clementia, liberalitas, and also a restorer of libertas, very much like Augustus, right? Restored the liberty of the Republic, even though he did quite the opposite. But eventually just sort of bring us back to the good old days of traditional Roman virtues, which went away under Constantius and Christianity and everything, though he is very careful not to bring religion really into the discussion here, so soon into Julian's reign. So what I'll focus on in this panegyric is what he says about philosophy, which is not much, but it is in his context where he restores various types of libertas, freedom of thought, freedom of religion, freedom to practice divination, to practice astrology, and other arts that Constantius II and the sons of Constantine and Constantine himself had been putting restrictions on in Roman law. And so this is what Julian has to say, what Mamertinus has to say about Julian and philosophy. Quote, "Philosophy was shortly heretofore viewed with suspicion, and was not only stripped of her privileges, but even charged and convicted. You, Julian, not only exonerated her of this verdict, but dressed her in purple, crowned her with gold and jewels, and seated her on a royal throne, regale solio," right? So in other words, this is very much an image of, say, Lady Philosophy, as here from, a medieval kind of illustration of Boethius, right? Looking very much like a tetrarchic, post-Diocletian Roman emperor or empress seated upon a throne. Many people interpret this passage to mean that Julian is an embodiment of philosophy itself, because Julian is the one dressed in purple with the shiny crowns and jewels, like a post-Diocletian emperor, and that he's the embodiment of philosophy as a philosopher king, and things like that. And that would be consistent, again, with post-Diocletianic ideology, Constantian ideology, especially as presented by the philosopher orator Themistius. So for instance, Themistius as a philosopher orator is very much interested in also seeing his honorands as philosophers, in other words, as Platonic philosopher kings. So for instance, in his Panegyric of Constantius that he delivers in Rome in the 350s, he says, "Rome preferred a philosopher, me, Themistius, and was seeking one out, assuming this to be the most suitable and fitting to be employed for honoring a good emperor and philosopher." So he is calling Constantius also a philosopher king, right? So that would resonate with this whole idea, this image that Mamertinus talks about. Also, a big part of Themistius's kind of imperial ideology is not only the idea of the philosopher as the emperor as philosopher, but also the emperor as a sort of semi-divine embodiment of law itself. Okay, so in a couple different places in his Panegyrics to Jovian, which is Julian's successor, he says things like, "But do you wish to gain a full realization from philosophy?" It says that the emperor is an animated law, right? A nomos empsukos. So in other words, he is a law that has a soul. He's a living law, right? And is therefore a law unto himself. Okay. Elsewhere he says, "You yourself, Jovian, the emperor, are an animated law and above those that have been written." So the emperor himself in his person is superior to any sort of written laws in Roman law or elsewise, right? And people like my friend Leo Nicolai would say that this corresponds to the idea that the emperor as an ideal philosopher is intelligizing perfectly, and so his mind is therefore equivalent with the divine nous, and therefore, and Julian talks about how the equivalence between nous and nomos, right? So law as nomos as the distribution, the dianomy of nous, right? So that's probably what Themistius is getting at here as well, right? Which justifies why the emperor seems to be above the law when he's above himself, because law is intellect ultimately, okay? And finally, this image of the philosopher, semi-divine, law unto himself emperor is also dressed up in very shiny purple clothes, right? So for instance, Themistius in his first oration to Constantius says, thank you. Yeah, right, because all right. So he says that he says, "The more refined of these orators approach you more rather closely, touching upon your crown, cloak, undefiled belt, and sparkling robe," right? So very much images of Constantius that we see in material culture, such as this shiny gold plate that you can find in St. Petersburg. However, this is not how Mamertinus presents Julian himself in this panegyric. Quite the opposite. It is philosophy that is seated on the royal throne, not a philosopher king, not Julian, because later on in the panegyric, he talks about the earlier in the day, the consular inaugurations, when Julian basically showed up and picked up the consuls and escorted them to the Senate House, where they could be inaugurated and they could deliver the speech. Okay, couple ahead. There we go. This is what he has to say, among other things. And so right away, he, Julian, presents himself as an escort and proceeds, flanked on both sides by the consuls in their togae praetextatae. So the toga, the consular toga with the purple stripes, right? Differing not much from his own magistrates, both in the type and color of his clothing. Okay, so in other words, Julian is dressed up very much like the dude in the photograph. Okay, probably with more hair on his head though. This is actually not typical for an emperor, a Roman emperor, in a consular inauguration. He's usually wearing a toga trabea, which is all purple, right? And it's got gold trim. So it's very unusual that Julian himself is dressing like any other senator here. Okay, and this is consistent with Julian's image throughout this panegyric of not being a statue-esque emperor like I'll get it. Not being like Constantius II, whom Ammianus just depicts, riding into Rome, looking still as a statue, dressed up in all this gold and jewelry, right, as this sort of semi-divine being. Rather, Julian in the panegyric by Mamertinus, he's moving, he's human, he's embodied, right? He talks about how he sweats, okay? He calls attention to his actual body, how he's going through the exertions of being a soldier and serving the state, okay? Very dynamic, okay, very involved, rather than this sort of just semi-divine image that people like Themistius or Ammianus here are painting, okay? And so I interpret that to mean that Julian is not to be identified with philosophy on the throne. He is in fact serving philosophy. He is working as emperor, as soldier on behalf of philosophers, okay, of the traditional religion and everything in between, okay? Let's move on to Ammianus for a little bit, and there's a lot more I could say here, but I'll just give you a little background on Ammianus. So he is a miles quondam et Graecus, so an ex-soldier. He was a Greek, possibly from Antioch, and he served under Julian, but he was in a subordinate capacity. So Mamertinus was sort of in his consistory, whereas Ammianus, to some extent, was in Julian's among Julian's troops. So he had less of a close relationship with him. So by the early 390s, about 3 decades after Julian's death, right, he completes his res gestae, his great history that covers the reigns of Nerva to the death of Valens at Adrianople. But we only have books 14 through 31, which pick up in the year 353. And so it covers about half the reign of part of the reign of Constantius, and then of course covers Julian, which at that point the narrative dilates over several books, and it's thought that Julian is sort of the central hero, at least of that part of the res gestae. And Ammianus himself calls his sort of the content of his account of Julian laudativa paene, so near panegyrical, right? So we want to compare this perhaps to what Mamertinus is doing. However, Ammianus, as many know, is also very critical of Julian, and so he presents him as a hero to be admired, but a tragic hero, right, who makes mistakes and ultimately brings about his own downfall by his own actions, overdetermined also by the course of fate, okay? And as I read kind of Ammianus' Julian starts as the sort of ideal Roman hero doing all the proper things a Roman leader should do, especially in terms of the traditional religion, practicing divination, right, deferring, and not being superstitiosus, right, not being a deviant in terms of the proper exercise of Roman religion that a Roman general in the field would be practicing, okay? Well, later on in the narrative, especially when he becomes sole emperor and Augustus, he starts losing kind of grip on that Romanitas to the point where eventually he becomes much more Greek and enamored of various kind of Greek philosophers who are at variance with the manners of Roman religion. And so this is kind of the passage that I'll focus on. late in the narrative, when they're already in Persia, Julian and the army are seeing various omens in the sky, lightning strikes and animals dying and everything. And so, like a traditional Roman army, they bring along Etruscan haruspices, soothsayers, and they are raising lots of red flags here, lots of alarm bells. Okay, they're saying, this meteorological phenomenon is an omen from the gods. We need to abort the campaign and go back to Roman territory. Okay, and however, Julian also has his coterie of philosophers with him. Okay, Maximus of Ephesus and Priscus, right? His mentors, who are Iamblichean theurgists, Neoplatonists, right, who have a very different way of doing things. And what Ammianus seems to be doing here is that people like Maximus, who he calls the philosophy, using a Greek loanword rather than a pure Latin word for these types of people to sort of kind of foreignize them, right, are just explaining away these omens in the sky in very meteorological, materialistic terms, right? It was rather a rush of a rather strong wind thrust downward from the upper atmosphere toward what was further down by some force. This is how they interpret lightning strike. Well, that sounds familiar if you're familiar with Aristophanes. It seems that Ammianus is actually parodying these philosophers, these Iamblichean philosophers, by essentially bringing up how the sophists and sort of the parodies of philosophers from Aristophanes' clouds, and how Socrates would explain lightning. So, for example, Strepsiades asks, what is lightning? And Socrates says, whenever a dry wind rises up, high up, and becomes trapped in these clouds, it inflates them from within like a bladder, then by necessity breaks them open and comes out violently because of its density, igniting itself by its forceful outpouring. And then not long before we get various fart jokes following this passage, as you can imagine, right? But you can see it's a very similar passage, so I think that Ammianus is trying to recall that the philosophy around Julian are quacks, right? They are completely misreading the situation, and that the traditional Roman diviners, right, need to be taken seriously, right? And we see this other passage where Julian is essentially, again, he is just listening to Maximus and Priscus, whatever they say about these omens, which they're either explaining away or they are, reinterpreting to be positive, whereas the Etruscan diviners are saying, no, this is a bad omen. And eventually, he basically says Julian has no goddamn idea what he's talking about when it comes to divination. Okay, and so that explains a lot of how Julian is committing hubris and bringing upon himself ate, and he's sort of becoming disillusioned and ignoring the warnings of the gods, which again is overdetermined. This is going to happen anyway. And kind of the last thing I want to talk about is there's another way that Ammianus kind of signals how Julian is losing grasp of what maybe Ammianus would call true philosophy, because Ammianus does not reject philosophy outright. Okay. And so there's a passage actually before the death of Constantius where it talks about, actually I'll get to that, there it is, where he talks about how Constantius, before he died, he had a premonition of this genius, right, this daimon that had been assigned to him that he could just barely see, and the word in Latin is squalidius, right, rather dimly. That he can see from time to time. And he noticed that the night, just shortly before he died, he noticed that he no longer could see it. He felt that it had abandoned his presence, right? This sort of tutelary daimon. And so Ammianus identifies this genius or daimon, right, as this sort of guardian spirit that is there to sort of help along people as soon as they're born and follows them throughout their lives. Cites various authors and oracles such as Menander to flesh out this idea. And he goes on to talk about how various famous people, both Greek and Roman, had been one of these exceptional class of people who not only had the vague premonition of their daimon or genius, but they could actually see them clearly, right, and communicate with them. Most famously Socrates, but before him Pythagoras, but also various Roman people, such as Numa Pompilius, who was kind of a traditional philosopher king, so that makes sense, but also he brings in various Roman heroes, military people we tend not to associate with philosophy, like Scipio and Marius and Augustus, right? And then, of course, also Hermes Trismegistus, Apollonius Tyana, and Plotinus, interestingly, right? Notice he doesn't include people like Iamblichus or any of these sort of theurgist philosophers that Julian is hanging out with, right? And so so if you are a very virtuous person, you are very capable of seeing your daimon, right? And he actually, Ammianus expounds upon kind of Plotinus's idea that, these things about how his theory of the daimons, interestingly enough, and is caused by a stainless relationship with the body, right? So they are morally pure. And as I'm wrapping up here, so Julian mentions how he had, before he was elevated to emperor, a clear vision of a genius, not any genius, the genius publicus of Rome, right? Holding a cornucopia saying, I have chosen you to become emperor, right? Accept the will of your troops to become emperor. And interestingly, he also had a vision perhaps of Helios himself, who appeared to him splendidior, rather in a very shiny way, very visible way, just before Constantius died, which is a nice contrast with the death of Constantius. However, just before Julian himself dies, he has this very vague vision, okay, squalidius, same word as with Constantius, barely seeing his genius or daimon, of the genius publicus famously departing from his tent while he's barely asleep at night, and this is just before he dies. And so all along, at least, it seems that, or at least initially, Julian was among those classes of people who could visibly see their daimon or genius, but then he lost touch with it, quite literally. And then before he died, it becomes dim and then eventually departs from him. Okay, so just as my conclusions here, sorry to go a little over, you can deduct it from my Q&A. Mamertinus and Ammianus have some similar ways of looking at Julian philosophy. Certainly, he sees Mamertinus sees Julian as not the traditional kind of tetrarchic Constantinian semi-divine philosopher king, but rather he is an emperor, he's a soldier, right, and that he is in service to philosophy of religious liberty. And I think Mamertinus' closer relationship to Julian accounts for why this is closer to Julian's own self-conception, right, and which I talked about in the book. Whereas Ammianus, with his more distance from Julian, is much more skeptical of Julian's kind of engagement with Iamblichian Neoplatonism and theurgy, and he thinks that it's at variance with proper religio romana. And so, if the less he is adhering to proper religio romana, the loss of romanitas, which is corresponding to the loss of his connection to his tutelary daimon, right? And so, as a result, Julian is associated with kind of parodies of quack philosophers brought from Aristophanes comedy rather than true philosophers like Plotinus, right, or Numa Pompilius, or Pythagoras. And so that's the end of him. And so thank you for your attention.